The chandeliers of Harrington House blazed with light, scattering diamonds across the marble floor, where noble ladies swirled in their gowns and gentlemen boasted over wine. Yet, for Lady Evelina Harcourt, the evening was not a celebration, it was supposed to be her triumph. Only weeks before, her betrothal to Lord Charles Whitcomb had been announced, and whispers in society praised the match. Evelina, with her soft auburn hair and quiet grace, was no sparkling diamond like her stepsister Cassandra, but she carried herself with dignity. She had loved Charles in her own modest, tender way, believing his promises of loyalty. But tonight, beneath the glitter of the ballroom, those promises shattered like fragile glass. Evelina stood near the French windows, her fan trembling in her hand, as she watched Cassandra, radiant in crimson silk, lean into Charles's ear. The two laughed together, their bodies angled with intimacy. A hollow pain tightened Evelina's chest, yet she told herself it was merely her imagination. Surely her groom-to-be would not betray her. Yet as the evening unfolded, the truth grew impossible to ignore. Charles never came to her side. He never asked her for a dance. And when the music swelled for the midnight quadrille, he crossed the floor not to claim his fiancée, but to take Cassandra's hand in full view of every guest. A murmur swept through the crowd like a rising tide. Fans fluttered, monocles lifted, and whispers cut like knives. The betrothed ignored. How humiliating! Evelina felt her cheeks burn, but she forced her spine straight. Her mother had once told her, "When they laugh, stand taller. Pride is the armor they cannot pierce." She clung to those words, though her heart quaked beneath the armor. The quadrille ended with Cassandra flushed and triumphant, Charles bowing low before her, and a ripple of scandal crackling across the ballroom. Evelina's stepmother, Lady Selina, swept to her side with false sympathy. "My dear," she murmured, too loudly for comfort, "do not take it too hard. Men cannot resist Cassandra's charm. It is only natural Charles should prefer her." The words struck like arrows. Selina had always favoured her own daughter Cassandra, treating Evelina as a necessary burden after marrying Evelina's widowed father. Though Evelina was of equal noble blood, she had been made to feel lesser, overshadowed by Cassandra's golden beauty and practised wit. By dawn the next morning, Evelina's worst fears were confirmed. Lord Whitcomb arrived not to apologise, but to end their engagement altogether. He declared, without shame, that he had found a truer happiness with Cassandra, whose vivacity outshone Evelina's reserved manner. Evelina listened in silence, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, though her nails bit crescents into her palms. Cassandra stood nearby, feigning modest reluctance, though her smug smile betrayed her triumph. The scandal erupted across London within days. Gossip columns painted Evelina as a forsaken bride, jilted for her dazzling stepsister. Drawing-room whispers cast her as pitiable, unwanted, almost laughable. Invitations ceased to arrive. Friends grew distant. It seemed Evelina had been branded with a mark of failure no title or dowry could erase. And yet, in the quiet of her chamber, Evelina wept not only for the loss of Charles, whom she realized had never truly seen her, but for the shattering of her belief that dignity and loyalty were enough. She pressed her forehead to the cool glass of her window, staring at the fog rolling over the Thames, and whispered to the night, "I will not be broken. They may mock me, but I will not bow." But the truth was bitter. Society thrived on mockery. Cassandra, now flaunting her conquest, glowed brighter than ever, parading her victory. Evelina, once promised a future as Lady Whitcomb, stood alone, her name spoken only in hushed tones of ridicule. It seemed her life was destined to fade into the shadow of her stepsister's triumph. She could not know that beyond the horizon of her despair, The most powerful duke in England was already watching, already weighing her quiet dignity against the cruelty of a shallow world, and that fate was preparing a redemption Evelina herself could scarcely imagine. The morning after the broken betrothal dawned grey and cold, but Evelina's world felt darker still. She sat in her chamber, the heavy velvet drapes half-drawn, watching slivers of pale light creep across the carpet. A tray of untouched tea cooled on the table, the steam long since faded, much like her once bright hopes. Servants padded discreetly past her door, their whispers muffled but ever present. She knew what they said, that Lady Evelina had been discarded, shamed, made a fool of before all society. It was a humiliation that spread like wildfire, impossible to contain. By noon, the newspapers carried the scandal. Columns written with merciless wit proclaimed Cassandra Harcourt's triumph and Evelina's disgrace. A most unexpected change of heart, one paper crowed. Lord Whitcomb, once pledged to the elder Miss Harcourt, now betrothed to her younger and more charming stepsister. The words stung with cruel precision, reducing her pain to a spectacle for others' amusement. Evelina felt her cheeks burn with each mocking line, but she forced herself to read every word. Better to know the full measure of her shame than pretend ignorance. Her stepmother, Lady Selina, offered no comfort. "Really, Evelina," she said over breakfast, her tone clipped and dismissive, "you must accept that Cassandra was always destined for greatness. You ought to be grateful you had the chance to be considered at all. Not every young woman can command attention, and certainly not one so reserved." Evelina bit back a reply, though her stomach twisted. She knew Selina had always considered her less than Cassandra. Less beautiful, less charming, less worthy. But to have it spoken aloud in her moment of ruin felt like a cruelty she would not forget. Cassandra, of course, preened like a peacock in spring. She paraded her conquest through the drawing rooms of London, wearing Charles's ring as if it were a crown. She even dared to feign sympathy. "Do not be bitter, dear sister," she said with a false sweetness. "I cannot help where his heart has led him. Perhaps someone more quiet will suit you one day." Evelina managed a brittle smile in reply, but inside her spirit trembled with fury. Cassandra had not only stolen her betrothed, but dared to stand before her as though blameless. Night stretched long and sleepless. Evelina paced the length of her room, haunted by memories of Charles's empty promises. She recalled the gentle words he once spoke, the assurances of loyalty, the dreams they had discussed of a home together. Each memory now rang hollow, each echo a reminder of her foolish trust. "Was I so unworthy?" she whispered into the silence. "So invisible that I could be cast aside like a shadow?" Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she refused to weep in public. If the world wished to brand her a forsaken bride, she would meet its cruelty with composure. Still, beneath her proud exterior, Evelina's heart lay in ruins. She avoided society altogether, declining invitations that trickled half-heartedly her way. When she did venture out, once, to St. James's Park, she felt the sting of eyes upon her, the brush of whispered gossip. Two ladies walking arm in arm paused to whisper behind their fans, their laughter sharp as blades. Evelina turned her head, pretending not to hear, but the humiliation burned hot. Every step she took felt heavy with shame. Yet even in her grief, a fragile thread of resolve began to take root. On the third night after her betrothal was broken, she stood before her mirror, gazing at her reflection by candlelight. Her emerald eyes were swollen from weeping, her hair loose and wild, her gown rumpled. She hardly recognized herself. Slowly she straightened, lifting her chin as if before an audience. "I will not let them destroy me," she whispered fiercely. "They may call me forsaken, but I will not vanish into the shadows. I will endure." That vow, though born of desperation, marked a turning point. Evelina did not yet know how she would reclaim her dignity, nor could she imagine what power might intervene. But somewhere beyond the walls of her quiet chamber, her name had reached ears she could never have expected. The ears of a man who held the power to silence gossip with a word, to shield her from ridicule with his presence. The Duke of Ravenscroft, cold and unassailable, had heard of Lady Evelina Harcourt's humiliation. And while others mocked, he remembered the way she had stood at Harrington House, her heart breaking, yet her back unbent. It intrigued him, and soon the woman left in ruins would find an unexpected hand reaching into her darkness. The name of Duke Alistair Ravenscroft carried a weight that could silence entire drawing rooms. He was not merely a peer, but the peer, holder of the largest estates in England, master of a fortune that rivaled princes, and a man whose word could elevate or ruin reputations overnight. At 36, he was no young gallant eager for flirtations. He was a figure carved of marble, stern, commanding, and, in the eyes of society, untouchable. Many whispered he had no heart at all, that ambition and power had long since replaced it. But when news of Lady Evelina Harcourt's disgrace reached his ears, something unexpected stirred within him: intrigue. Alistair had attended the infamous ball at Harrington House, standing near the gallery as Cassandra flaunted her conquest of Lord Whitcomb. He had seen Evelina then, her face pale, but her posture unbroken, her emerald eyes bright with unshed tears she refused to let fall. Others saw a humiliated woman, he saw steel wrapped in silk. And that image had lingered with him, sharper than Cassandra's gaudy triumph or Whitcomb's pitiful weakness. Days later, while Evelina secluded herself in her chamber, the Duke arrived unannounced at the Harcourt residence. The household scrambled in a frenzy, Lady Selina gushed, Cassandra preened, and even Lord Harcourt rose from his usual stupor to welcome so powerful a guest. Evelina, summoned reluctantly to the drawing-room, entered in a simple gown of dove-grey muslin, her hair unadorned. She had no desire to impress. Yet when she lifted her gaze and met the Duke's storm-grey eyes, a jolt passed through her like the sudden clap of thunder before a summer storm. "Lady Evelina," the Duke said, bowing with measured grace, "I have come to pay my respects." His voice was deep, deliberate, every syllable carrying weight. The entire room held its breath. No one of his rank called upon a young lady unless there was purpose behind it. Cassandra shifted uneasily, her smile faltering for the first time in days. Evelina inclined her head. "You honour me, Your Grace." She fought to keep her voice steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. What business could he have with her? She expected polite pity at best, or perhaps some vague encouragement before he turned his attention to Cassandra, as all men eventually did. But Alistair Ravenscroft was not like other men. "I was present the night your betrothal was dissolved," he said, his gaze flicking briefly toward Cassandra, whose cheeks flushed crimson. "I observed the manner in which you bore humiliation before the eyes of all society. You did not cry out, you did not collapse. You stood as a lady should, grace under fire. Few could manage as much." A murmur rustled through the room. Lady Selina tittered nervously. Cassandra's fan snapped open with a sharp flick. Evelina, stunned, could only whisper, "You are kind to say so." "It is not kindness, it is truth." The Duke's eyes did not waver. "And I do not suffer falsehood." The silence that followed was suffocating. At last Cassandra broke it with a brittle laugh. "Your Grace, surely you do not mean to involve yourself in such a trivial scandal. Society will forget it soon enough." The Duke's head turned toward her, slow as the turning of a great clock's hand. "On the contrary, Lady Cassandra, society remembers what it is told to remember, and when cruelty is paraded as triumph, it is the duty of those with power to correct it." His words landed like a gauntlet thrown at her feet. Then he turned back to Evelina, his expression unreadable. "If you will allow, Lady Evelina, I would stand beside you, attend with you, walk with you. Let the world see that your worth has not been diminished by the fickle weakness of a false suitor." The offer stunned her into silence. To walk beside the Duke of Ravenscroft was no small matter. It was a shield stronger than any fortress. His presence could silence gossip, reverse disgrace, even elevate her above the sister who had betrayed her. Yet Evelina's pride recoiled. Was she to be a charity project for a man famed for his coldness? She drew a careful breath. "Your Grace, I do not wish to be pitied." His eyes, sharp as flint, softened for the briefest moment. "Nor do I offer pity. I offer alliance." The word hung in the air like a vow. Evelina searched his face, seeking mockery, but found none. And though uncertainty gnawed at her, something fierce whispered within her heart. Perhaps in the shadow of betrayal, fate had placed before her a protector more formidable than any she could have dreamed. And so began the whispers, low at first, then swelling through London like a storm. The forsaken bride was seen walking in Hyde Park, the Duke of Ravenscroft at her side. She, once mocked, now commanded every gaze. And Cassandra, for all her jewels and her stolen groom, found herself trembling with a new, bitter emotion. Envy. London society had never been so deliciously divided. 1 week earlier, Lady Evelina Harcourt had been the object of derision, a pitiful bride cast aside for her stepsister's charms. Now, in the span of days, she was transformed, her fall from grace erased by the sheer presence of the Duke of Ravenscroft at her side. Wherever they appeared together, Hyde Park, the Opera, even the Sunday promenade outside St. Paul's Cathedral, eyes followed them, tongues wagged, and speculation soared. Was this a romance, a scheme, or merely the Duke's eccentric fancy? No one could say for certain. But one truth was undeniable. Evelina Harcourt, once ridiculed, now stood at the very centre of society's gaze. At first, Evelina bore his company with a mixture of awe and unease. Alistair Ravenscroft was a man who inspired intimidation even when silent. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his expression often unreadable, save for the flicker of sharp intelligence in his eyes. He spoke little in public, but when he did, his words carried such weight that others leaned forward to catch every syllable. Walking beside him, Evelina felt both shielded and exposed, as though she were a sparrow perched upon the shoulder of an eagle. Yet in his rare private words to her, she sensed something unexpected: respect. One afternoon, as they rode through Hyde Park in his carriage, she dared to ask, "Why, Your Grace, would you involve yourself in my disgrace? You owe me nothing." He regarded her quietly, the clatter of hooves filling the silence. Then at last he said, "Because dignity is rare. You were wronged, yet you did not debase yourself. That deserves recognition." His answer was plain, but it struck Evelina to the core. No man, not even her own father, had ever spoken of her worth in such terms. She turned her face to the window, hiding the sudden warmth in her eyes. Word of their companionship spread, and with it came a curious reversal. Where once she had been pitied, now she was envied. Young ladies who had mocked her now watched with jealousy as she occupied the Duke's attention. Gentlemen, who once dismissed her, now bowed with exaggerated courtesy. Yet the whispers carried an edge. Was she merely his charity, his amusement? Evelina heard the murmurs, but she walked with her head high, repeating her vow each night before the mirror. I will not bow. Cassandra, however, burned with fury. She had stolen Charles Whitcomb with the smug belief that Evelina would fade quietly into insignificance. Instead, her stepsister now eclipsed her with a brilliance she could not match. Cassandra's beauty, once her greatest weapon, seemed cheap beside the solemn grandeur of the Duke's regard for Evelina. The bitterness festered until it spilled into her voice at supper one evening. "Really, sister?" Cassandra drawled, her eyes glittering with malice. "How fortunate you are, to rise from jilted shame to the arm of England's most powerful duke. Why, it almost seems as though scandal were your greatest asset." Evelina's fork paused above her plate, but she did not rise to the bait. "Or perhaps," she replied softly, "scandal reveals the strength of those who endure it." Her words silenced the table, and for once Cassandra found herself without a clever retort. Privately, Evelina began to notice sparks within herself whenever the Duke was near. The steady brush of his hand when assisting her from a carriage, the rare but lingering glance he cast her way, the low rumble of his voice when he bent close to inquire after her comfort. These moments stirred emotions she had sworn to bury after Charles's betrayal. She told herself it was folly, that the Duke's interest was protective, not romantic. And yet her heart, traitorous and hopeful, beat faster each time he drew near. One evening at the opera, as Cassandra schemed to draw the Duke's attention with a too bold display of flirtation, Alistair leaned subtly toward Evelina. "Your stepsister believes beauty is a crown," he murmured, "but crowns can be toppled, character endures." Evelina's breath caught. She turned her face to him, meeting his steady gaze. In that moment, under the gilded glow of the chandeliers, she realized that what had begun as protection was shifting into something more dangerous. For the first time since her heart had been broken, she felt a flicker of hope, of desire that she dared not name. But if Evelina's heart stirred with cautious wonder, Cassandra's burned with venomous jealousy. And jealousy, when sharpened by wounded pride, is a weapon that cuts without mercy. Cassandra would not rest until she found a way to humiliate her stepsister anew. The stage was set for a battle of sisters, and at its center stood the Duke, calm, inscrutable, but not untouched by the fire kindling between them. The Harrington Winter Ball was the pinnacle of the season, a glittering affair where every noble family vied for prominence under the golden chandeliers. For Evelina, it was a return to the very battlefield where she had once been humiliated. Whispers of her jilted betrothal still lingered in corners, though now they were muffled by the thunderous presence of the Duke of Ravenscroft at her side. Even so, Evelina entered the ballroom with her heart steady but wary, her gown of emerald silk chosen not for vanity, but to remind herself that dignity could be worn like armor. Cassandra had planned for this night with ruthless precision. She had enlisted allies among society's sharpest tongues, ensuring that Evelina would be once more cast into ridicule. "The Duke's charity project," one lady sneered, just loudly enough to be heard as Evelina passed. "A passing fancy at best," another whispered. Cassandra herself moved through the room with the air of a queen, Charles Whitcomb at her arm, his eyes darting nervously as though aware he had exchanged loyalty for glitter. The first hours passed in tense civility, but Cassandra was not content with whispers. As the music swelled and couples gathered for the quadrille, she seized her moment. With calculated sweetness, she approached the dais where Evelina stood beside the Duke. "Dearest sister," Cassandra purred, her voice carrying just far enough. "How brave of you to show your face tonight. Tell us, when the Duke tires of his amusement, will you vanish back into obscurity, or shall you find another sister's groom to borrow?" The cruelty struck like a blade, and the ballroom erupted in gasps and muffled laughter. Evelina's cheeks flamed, her hands trembling at her sides. For one agonizing heartbeat, she felt the old humiliation rise to drown her. But before she could summon a reply, the Duke stepped forward. The music faltered and stilled. Alistair Ravenscroft, towering and stern, let his voice cut through the air like the toll of a bell. "Enough!" The word echoed, commanding silence. Every gaze fixed upon him. Cassandra froze, her triumphant smirk withering. He turned his eyes to Evelina, and the room seemed to hold its breath. "Lady Evelina Harcourt is no one's charity. She is no one's shadow. She is a woman of strength, dignity, and rare grace. And she stands with me." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Evelina's heart pounded as the Duke took her hand, not gently, but firmly, with the authority of a man who made decisions and expected the world to follow. He bowed over her hand and pressed his lips to her gloved fingers, lingering just long enough to leave the gesture unmistakable. The ballroom erupted, not with laughter, but with a stunned hush. Whispers raced through the throng like wildfire. "Did you see? The Duke! He claimed her, before them all!" Cassandra's face blanched, her plan dissolving into ashes before her eyes. Charles Whitcomb looked on, his expression stricken with the sudden realization of what he had lost. Evelina, caught between shock and awe, felt her chest swell with something she had not dared to feel in weeks: vindication. This was no charity. This was a declaration. Before all of London, the most powerful Duke in England had chosen to stand beside her, not as protector only, but as something deeper, something unmistakably intimate. The dance resumed, though the whispers never ceased. As Alistair guided Evelina into the quadrille, every eye followed them. She moved as if in a dream, her hand resting in his, her heart trembling, with a mixture of disbelief and wonder. The warmth of his gaze steadied her more than any vow of loyalty had ever done. Later, as the night waned and the guests began to depart, Evelina found herself alone with him in the shadowed gallery. Her voice, hushed and uncertain, broke the silence. "Why did you do it? You have put your own reputation at risk. They will say you are bewitched, or worse." Alistair's eyes gleamed like steel in the candlelight. "Let them say what they will. I do not answer to society. And as for risk, Evelina, there is none. I know my choice." Her breath caught, her heart aching with questions she dared not speak. But one truth blazed clear. Cassandra's triumph had crumbled, and Evelina's fate had shifted. No longer the forsaken bride, she had become something greater, a woman whose worth was not only defended but exalted by a man whose power none dared challenge. And in that moment, though fear and hope warred within her, Evelina felt the spark of destiny burn brighter than ever before. The wedding of Cassandra Harcourt to Lord Charles Whitcomb had been intended as a triumph, a glittering crown upon her conquest. Invitations had been sent weeks in advance, the church adorned with garlands of roses, the pews filled with London's elite, eager to witness the union that had humiliated Evelina. Cassandra relished the anticipation, imagining Evelina cowering in her chamber, forgotten and broken. But as the great doors of St. George's Chapel opened on that fateful morning, it was not Cassandra who captured the gaze of all assembled. It was Evelina. She entered not as a guest, but as the focus of a spectacle, that would overturn every whispered rumour. On her arm was the Duke of Ravenscroft, his presence commanding silence in the vast nave. Evelina wore a gown of ivory silk, simple yet radiant, her head held high. The crowd parted as they advanced, shock rippling like a wave. Cassandra, already at the altar, stiffened, her lips tightening as the colour drained from her face. This was her stage, her victory, and now it was being stolen in the very moment of its consummation. The officiant hesitated, uncertain, as Alistair guided Evelina forward. Then, with a voice that rang clear and resonant, the Duke spoke. "There will be no vows spoken today, save mine. Lady Evelina Harcourt was forsaken unjustly, scorned by those unworthy of her. I will not allow it to stand before God, before this company, and before every whispering tongue in England. I claim her as my bride." Gasps filled the chapel, a thunder of shock and awe. Cassandra's hand trembled on Charles's arm, her perfect composure shattering. "You cannot! This is my wedding!" she cried, her voice shrill, echoing against the vaulted ceiling. Alistair's gaze turned upon her, cool and implacable. "Your wedding is built on betrayal and vanity. Mine is built on truth. Which do you suppose will endure?" His words struck like hammer blows, and Cassandra faltered, her face twisting in rage. All eyes turned to Evelina. Her breath came fast, her heart hammering. This moment, unthinkable days ago, now stood before her like the edge of a cliff. To accept him meant stepping into a life she had never imagined, into the storm of society's scrutiny and the weight of a duke's power. Yet as she looked into Alistair's eyes, steady, unwavering, filled with a depth she had not thought him capable of, she knew her answer. "I accept," she said, her voice trembling yet clear. "If you will have me, I will stand beside you." A hush fell, thick and reverent. The officiant, wide-eyed, stammered, but then, seeing no protest from the Duke, hastily altered the ceremony. The words of marriage were spoken not for Cassandra and Charles, but for Alistair and Evelina. And as he placed the golden ring upon her finger, the Duke of Ravenscroft bent and kissed her hand, not as a show of power this time, but as a vow of devotion. The chapel erupted, not with laughter or scorn, but with applause, stunned though it was. Some clapped from awe, others from the thrill of scandal, but all knew they had witnessed history. Cassandra fled in disgrace, Charles trailing helplessly after her, their triumph undone in a single stroke. Evelina, dazed yet radiant, felt tears blur her vision as she looked at the man beside her. She had been ridiculed, abandoned,
cast into ruins. But now, standing at the altar with the Duke's vow still echoing in her ears, she felt restored, not by his power alone, but by the recognition of her own worth. When they emerged from the chapel into the sunlight, the bells rang not for Cassandra's victory, but for Evelina's redemption. And as the Duke of Ravenscroft clasped her hand, leading her into a future neither had foreseen, Evelina knew that her story had been rewritten. She was no longer the woman mocked for her loss. She was the bride chosen by the most powerful duke in England, not for pity, not for duty, but for the strength of her spirit and the fire of her heart. And in his vow she heard the truth that mattered most, that love, when forged in the crucible of betrayal and pride, could emerge stronger than any crown, brighter than any triumph, and enduring enough to silence every whisper.